Welcome to Unsilent with your hosts Dave and Brian. This is not another current events podcast. We're digging deeper, diagnosing, and discussing what's really going on today, how we got here, and providing observations for future generations.
Welcome to Unsilent. We're Brian and Dave, and we'd love to hear where you think we got it right and where you think our commentary is just off the rails, which you can do by going to Rumble or to various social channels or our very own website, unsilentpodcast.com. So with all of that said, Brian, what do you have for us today? I understand you've got something kind of cool.
Yeah, well, depends on how you look at it, I guess. It's educational. I don't know if I'd call it cool, but
Yeah.
Before I get to the video I want to share, and I'm going to kind of do like what we did with Mr. Yuri Bezmenov a few weeks ago.
Oh,
This
yeah.
guy's much more current. This is a video I'm going to share with you that was released on Tucker Carlson's X page here a few weeks ago. His name was Mike Benz. But before I get to that, do you think it's fair to say that Lincoln was perhaps the most hated president we've ever had?
Yeah, I think so.
Why,
Yes.
why would you agree with that? Why would you say that he's the most hated president?
Well, because about half of the country thought he was out to ruin their lives. The South basically thought and to change cultural norms that they had established. So yeah, I think that's probably fair to say.
I think it would be based on my education of this topic, which is not tremendous, but I don't think I'm like in the dark on it either. I think that about half the country thought he was going to ruin their way of life, right?
Yeah.
And the system of slavery was, that's what we had to have so that we could be, we could earn a decent living and things like that, right?
Yep.
And so I started thinking, like, what are the parallels of that today? Like, I think that in this moment in time in 2024, I would estimate that we're closer to, again, when I say Civil War, I don't mean trenches and muskets and things like that,
Sure.
but that level of antagonism and tribalism and all that kind of stuff.
Oh, yeah.
And so I was like, well, what are the parallels of that today? And the question always, like you and I have talked about, like the kind of crown of thorns that were, you got media and academia and the blob and all these different entities that have kind of joined forces. And
right.
It seems to me that it's not that different than the Civil War, where you have some people who need this way to go on to protect their livelihoods, and other folks who want a new way to bolster their livelihoods, right?
Right.
And that's my question has always been why? Like why is media and academia and big business and how are these guys all linked together? And this video I'm going to share is a guy named Mike Benz, and he kind of explains it. And it's interesting to learn how these things are all interconnected, but it's also like maddening as I just get so angry watching it. But I think it's super important for us to watch it, because one of the things that I see in Facebook discourse and X discourse is a lot of like, well, I want to see what the other side says. There's a lot of like, I want to be the moderate one and like, ask both sides what their perspective is. And
Sure.
My general feeling on that is, if you ask congressional Democrats their opinion on something, and you ask congressional Republicans their opinion on something, many people today see that as asking opposing forces their view on a topic. Right. I see it as it's like asking, if we were at war with Russia, like asking the Russian Navy what they think and the Russian Army what they think. Like,
right.
Like it's all the same. Is that making sense?
It does. It does. Yeah.
Speaking clearly there.
Yeah, there's the entrenched interest to want to keep things a certain way or want to keep control in a certain way, and there's everybody else. So yes, it does make sense.
So it feels to me like a large percentage of the population today believes that the battle is between left and right, and I don't believe that anymore. I believe that the battle is between the in crowd and the out crowd.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that's right.
So okay. So the first, and all these clips are a little long. I apologize for that. They are what they are. It's a 2 hour and 7 minute interview. I would recommend for anyone listening today, like go watch this whole thing. It's worth every minute of your time to understand it. But you and I are speaking to Kenny G, a guy who's alive 60 years from now and is going through his own crisis era similar to ours. And while the details may be different, I think that it's educational to understand how these things kind of develop. So,
Yeah.
let me share my screen. And for those listening, I apologize. I'm going to be a little sluggish on getting the time right. Last time I did this, I was just hitting start and stop, and everything worked well. But now I have to like fast forward through the video and find the right time to queue it up. So I'm going to be a little more clunky than I was last time for sure. And there's my share button. All right. So here's the first segment. This is about a minute and a half long or so, but we'll see what Mike says about a couple things, and you and I will chat about it in a second.
Right. Bring it, Mike.
Mike Benz.
But, one of the things beginning, and I come back to this Brazil
Can I
case.
just ask you pause one last time? One of the things I've learned from you over the past couple of years, I've learned a lot from you, but one big picture idea that I didn't fully appreciate till I listened to you carefully was that our foreign policy drives our domestic policy.
There's no such thing as domestic policy.
Exactly.
Every country.
I didn't understand. I grew up in a world where there was the foreign policy and like you overthrow Mossadegh or whatever. Maybe that's good for America. You don't even think about it. We're fighting the Soviets. It's not a problem because we are an island of freedom here in the United States. And your reporting and analysis suggests exactly what you just said. There is no domestic policy. Everything that happens in this country is an outgrowth, a function of our management of the world.
Yes. There's no such thing as domestic policy because every country's domestic policy is another country's foreign policy. Whatever you do in the United States or whatever a foreign country wants to change its labor laws. Well, guess what? That impacts the bottom line of U.S. corporations who employ labor pools there. A foreign country wants to nationalize its graphite industry. Well, guess what? Now America can't make pencils. Every internal policy of every other country on earth impacts the bottom line of some U.S. national champion. Now, how the State Department defines national interest is essentially the college of corporations and financial firms that are U.S. national champions.
All right. So let me stop there. So one of the questions I've always had is, what's this relationship between big business like Wall Street, the Microsofts, the Caterpillars, the whatever, what's the relationship there? And so he's beginning to explain it. And like, why don't you paraphrase? Like, what'd you take away from that?
Well, I mean, basically, I think what he's saying is that there's nothing you can do in a domestic policy sense. I mean, he says there is no domestic policy, but there's nothing you can do because all of these major companies, as he calls them, champions, are so intertwined in the world that and it's really true. If you look at like Apple or Nvidia, the Mag 7, as they call them on the stock market these days, the multi-trillion-dollar companies, they're literally everywhere. And so therefore, and they affect everything, including what we do here and what we do abroad. So it's all one big intertwined mess.
Yeah. And one of the things I didn't record this particular part. One of the things he mentions is there's over 500 million people in the EU versus 330 million people in the US.
Right.
So it's a bigger market there.
Right.
And so there's more dollars there than there are available here. And that's kind of, one of the foundational things about this. So,
right.
All right. So now he's going to shift gear. Now this, to be clear, this guy, Mike Benz, which I would recommend everyone follow him, it's Mike Benz Cyber is his Twitter handle. And one of the things that he said again, he made this comment as in this recording that I didn't save for us, but he says, I understand what's probably going to happen to me at some point because he's a former federal employee, kind of exposing the things that they would probably rather him not have him be exposing. And so I think it's important for Kenny G to understand, like, as they look back in this period of time, like, what was it like? Well, people who are speaking out about these things have legitimate fears for their lives. Like, not only has Trump had a couple of assassination attempts, a guy was killed at one of his things, and other people have now being reported being injured at his things, but the consequences of speaking up are significant.
Yeah.
Right? All right. So he's going to talk about free speech here a little bit. So I'm going to again, it's a fairly long clip, about a minute and a half, but he's going to talk about free speech here and why that is becoming problematic.
Well, the point that I'm trying to make here is the free speech absolutist who was in charge of U.S. government projection of free speech. All it took was one election for the entire diplomacy architecture that this principle of free speech was based on to get completely bottomed out. All it took was Donald Trump getting elected for, arguably 200 years of a First Amendment principle and 70 years of this principle of exporting the First Amendment to be entirely discarded because it was leading to the wrong kinds of people being elected. Free speech on the internet was blamed for the loss of the Philippines election by the State Department in 2016. It was blamed for the events of Brexit. This is why the U.S. State Department funds so many London-based NGOs and university centers and influence operations to stop Nigel Farage and the Brexit movement. It was blamed for the rise of Trump in 2016. It was blamed for the rise of Bolsonaro. It was blamed for the rise of Modi in India. In country after country, the free and open internet, unfiltered alternative news, the rise of citizen journalists, the rise of citizens in those countries who have larger voices than CIA-backed media, than USAID-funded media, than State Department-funded media, has meant that the State Department has lost control of those countries. And what happened was, after 2016, the technology and the networks were established to be able to add a new toolkit to American diplomacy, which is diplomacy by censorship. And we have formal government programs at the State Department dedicated to getting foreign countries to pass domestic censorship laws to stop the rise of right-wing populist parties in those countries. I'm going to say that again. We have formal government programs at the State Department whose job is to lobby foreign countries and pressure foreign countries to pass censorship laws to stop the rise of domestic populist groups.
All right. So now he's transitioning from talking about like the coordination between our government and these multi-trillion dollar, certainly hundreds of billion dollar, companies, and how, like he said in there, Trump getting elected led to the wrong outcome. And so 200 years of the First Amendment being like our kind of rallying cry as a society has all gone away. And that in the timing, like, you and I talk a lot about how, well, back in 2008, it wasn't like this. And back in 2007, it wasn't like this. And back in 1999, it wasn't like this. And he explains in other videos he does as well, like from the inception of the CIA in 1949 or 1948 or whatever it was, like how all this came to be. But we just had Zuckerberg come out 2 weeks ago or whatever it was and talk about how he was pressured. Facebook was pressured not to say things. And if not for Elon Musk buying Twitter, like that was all censored. And so it's starting to paint a picture like the why these things are happening, not just the frustration that they are.
Well, and it's strange because if we talk about these things wouldn't have happened back then, like, 15, 20 years ago. And I wouldn't have believed that they would possibly be happening now, at that time, because, at that time I would have consigned all of that to kind of like, globalist conspiracy theories or something like that. But you're right. We have Zuckerberg coming out discussing how he's pressured by the government to censor certain information about COVID and about other things. And of course, once you give a shark the taste of blood, then it's going to be looking for blood everywhere, right? So it seems like that's kind of the expansionist, desires of the powerful are just seeping into everything. It's amazing. It's bizarre.
Well, I remember when I was in, I don't know if I think it was probably junior high school, maybe elementary school, but I remember many teachers telling me the most powerful device that was ever invented was a printing press.
Right.
Because it was able to disseminate information and wise up the population to what was really going on and spread unfavorable news amongst the masses. And social media is like, that on steroids, obviously. I mean, it's just
exactly,
it's just, so that it all, the more we dive into these things, like you and I learn these specifics as we're going along, but it's human nature is always the same. Like people they change the rules so they get in power. And once they get power, they don't want the rules changed because the rules that are in place are what got them in power. And then they need to silence everybody who opposes that. Like it's pretty basic, right?
It's played out over and over. And that's, I think, the thing for Kenny G in the future to learn is that even though the mechanisms of control change, even though the mechanisms of censorship, and even though the mechanisms of centralized power will change from, one generation to the next. The underlying motivation of humans in power, absolute power tends to corrupt. Absolutely. All of those motivations remain in place, no matter how much you pretty them up with, with titles and with programs and with all the different, everything's going to be so wonderful, utopian language, no matter how that changes from generation to generation, the underlying motivation stays the same. And that's where the real danger is.
Yeah, and every time this comes around, we say, "Yeah, but we've evolved. We're different.
Yeah,
we're
right.
we're not using horse-drawn carriages. We're not we're not doing all these barbaric things. We have air conditioning, for crying out loud."
Yeah, we equate our technical advancement to our moral, ethical, wisdom advancement,
emotional,
and all that. And that's the problem. I mean, that is the problem, is because sure, we've advanced technically, but our wisdom is not caught up with our technical capabilities, our engineering.
Yeah. So here he's going to explain how it is that both sides of the political aisle currently are talking about how they're saving democracy, and he's going to explain how that could possibly be the case. So here we go.
Oh, I can answer that because it's basically doctrine. There's been a redefinition of democracy from meaning the consensus of individuals to meaning the consensus of institutions. And this is a very clever sleight of hand reframing trick that they played after the 2016 election in the US, and they were setting this up. So just to get
they're playing with revolution here. I mean, they've lost their legitimacy. So I'm not going to try to overthrow the US government. I'm 55. I'm not going to do that. But at some point, someone's going to try to do that, and it's going to be kind of hard to see why they're not justified in doing that, because it's not legitimate. Their legitimacy comes from the consent of the governed.
All right. So the reason I kept that last part in there, where Tucker Carlson saying, "Well, I'm not going to overthrow the government," but they're playing with revolution here, is because I think that is an undercurrent. That's not, people don't verbalize that a lot, I would say.
Yeah.
I do believe that that's kind of an undercurrent of thought. Like, okay, and this explains the fourth turning. This explains why every total war happens in a fourth turning, because they push and push and push and push until people say, "We won't take it anymore."
Right. Well, because and people, when I think one of the canary in the coal mine there is when all of the institutional trust is lost. When you lose I mean, it used to be in the 70s, we had institutional trust abounding. I mean, we trusted the TV news at night. Everybody watched the 6 o'clock news, took it for granted. Everybody, whether it was the military or the police or government. Sure. I mean, people said, yeah, the government, there's, but even then there was enough institutional trust that Republicans and Democrats both said, "Nixon, you got to go, buddy." So, that could never happen today. So there's when institutional trust collapses to the point where, you see these funny surveys that like Congress is less popular than the common cold, or Congress is less popular than stepping in dog poop in your yard, or some ridiculous thing like that. When you get to the point where there's very few institutions left that people have any level of trust in, then the question, the underlying sort of emotional thing is, well, why do we have these institutions? Shouldn't we get rid of these institutions? I mean, Tucker, I feel the same as Tucker. I'm not going to do any kind of revolution. I can't even envision that. But when you get to the point where enough people say, all these institutions are corrupt, they don't serve us, they serve the powerful, the rich, all of that, then you're at a point where you are at risk of somebody saying, well, then let's go replace them. Let's take them down. You hope that happens in a peaceful way. But it doesn't always, just speaking historically, not predicting anything, but speaking historically, it doesn't always happen in a peaceful way. And that's
and if
scary.
you look at, like, as the fourth turnings unravel, like you look at like the list of like the worst presidents of all time,
right?
The ones that are generally categorized as the worst are the ones that are right before the crisis.
Right.
Lincoln is, nowadays looked at as perhaps the greatest president,
right?
But James Buchanan, who bumbled everything leading up to the Civil War, he's looked at as one of the worst. You look
Yep.
at Warren Harding in the 20s, like
Right.
one of the most corrupt presidents we've ever had,
Yep.
leading up to the fourth turning. I mean, it's and you look at the English version of that, like the people from England who were in the colonies, you know, they
Yeah.
had corrupted things, like the
Yeah.
people revolted because of corruption, and
Yep.
and this you know, we establish these baseline rules and the structure of society and the pillars of our society and the institutions, and then slowly the efficacy and the good intentions all evaporate, right?
Well, you know, it occurs to me too, Brian, that you said two things in that sentence that typically they've gone together. You've had the rules and the institutions have gone together. The rules have kept the institutions on track, you know, moving in a positive direction. But one of the things I think that we can clearly see now is the rules of the institutions have become separated. So there's
Yeah.
rules, but the institutions don't play by those rules. I mean, it's just like
Well-
the most extreme example on earth is one of the best I've mentioned this before. One of the best constitutions on earth is the Constitution of North Korea. It's a great constitution. It reads wonderfully. It's like we get all these rights, we got all this, but you know, there is no connection between the rules and the institutions. So when that happens, when the rules and the institutions get separated from one another, then you do have a real collapsing situation.
Well, and like he's describing, where all they do is a sleight of hand with the verbiage, and we say protecting democracy, we all interpret that as, you know, the citizens, like their needs are paramount.
Yeah.
And what they're actually saying is the institution's needs are paramount, but they're using the same language.
Right.
So they just corrupted the language there a little bit to send the right message to the people that they want to talk to. But the rest of us are going, how could this be? How could it? And I think that the lack of loyalty to, you know, real concern and objectivity and honesty and like prioritizing the needs of citizens, like that is the stuff that people can't tell what's going on, but they know it's screwed up.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
All right. So now he's going to talk a little bit more about NATO and like why all this stuff matters as it relates to NATO here.
Donald Trump and Brexit. And at the time, NATO, its biggest fear was free speech on the internet. In early 2017, NATO periodicals were saying the biggest threat to NATO is not a hostile foreign attack from Russia. They would come to eat these words 5 years later. They argued conventional warfare is over. The biggest threat to NATO is free speech on the internet because it's allowing the rise of Marine Le Pen in France. It's allowing the rise of Matteo Salvini in Italy. It's allowing the rise of the Vox Party in Spain, AfD in Germany. So we would have Frexit, Grexit, Italexit, Spexit. The entire EU would come undone, which meant NATO's commercial arm comes undone, which means NATO comes undone, which means there's no enforcement arm for the IMF and the World Bank. So it would be like the ending scene from Fight Club where the credit card companies all crash down just because you're allowed to speak your mind on the internet.
All right. So again, all these pieces are coming together, right? Like the WEF is in here and the World Bank and all this kind of stuff. And again, for me, my question has always been, how are these things seemingly different institutions, whether it's media or academia or whatever, like how are they all intertwined? And he's explaining all this stuff.
Well, we've generally thought that they were separate. I mean, usually and I have too. I mean, for the most part, you talked to me 10 years ago. It's like, well, NATO's over here. It's a military alliance, and you've got, they've got the economies over here. And there's some, angel thread connection, but they're not really truly intertwined. And there's these big corporations, but they're doing their thing. So you've got all these different players. So the thing that's fascinating about this is the notion of deep connection between them. And I mean, but then you step back from it and you say, well, of course there's deep connection. I mean, because where does the money come from to fund the, Dwight David Eisenhower's military industrial complex? Where does the money come from for that? Well, it comes from the corp. I mean, and even going back to World War II, you could really say that who won World War II was the industrial base of America. That's, the military had to carry it out, but without the John D. Rockefellers of the world, it wouldn't happen.
Or Ford, making airplanes instead of cars and all that stuff. Yeah. Yeah. And I think for me, like I I've like you and I talk about this stuff like it always comes down to power and money, right?
Yeah.
That's what people in power want was more power and more money and more
Yep.
influence and more power and more money and more influence. But I never understood the intermediate level. Like I understood high level, of course that's what they want. They because everybody always wants more power, money, and influence. I get that part. I get the details of like you manipulate tax laws here and there to be in your favor. I get that part
Right.
too. It was the middle part that I just like I don't get it. But hearing him talk us through like, okay, well, there's 500 plus million people in the EU. That's where the money source is. And if the EU falls apart, NATO falls apart, all that is gone. And
Right.
that has a very negative impact on the multi-trillion dollar companies. And as he stated in the very beginning, there is no domestic policy. It's all foreign
Right.
policy. And all policy, therefore, is to help these multinational companies make more money.
Right. And I think you could also say that there's an implicit morality that's adopted by that structure. And by that, I mean that it's like, okay, we can't let the EU fall apart because, there's a big market for us and who's going to come in? Russia and China are going to come in and they're
Yeah.
going to do things their way. We can't have that because, we're the West and we,
Yeah.
and certainly I believe, we don't want Russia and China to come in, but you end up with the justification for saying, well, we're going to assert more control than we're really legally given, and we're going to bolster our own position, but it's just to protect, this
Democracy.
So it's
Well, he talks to all those things you just said. He talks about Russia specifically, China specifically, and how this is kind of all done in the guise of doing exactly what
yeah,
you're describing. I didn't save those clips because it's not, we only have an hour and it's
yeah.
a 2-hour thing. But and also he gets into things that are more about those specifics. But you're 100% on point. He goes into a fair amount of detail on this. All right, so let's move on here to the next clip here, where he's going to talk a little bit more about redefining democracy here.
But here's how they rescued democracy. They said, we need to stick with democracy, even though we don't like its outcomes, because it would take too long to turn the Titanic. All of our cloak and dagger, black ops, plausibly deniable toppling of governments worldwide is all in the name of democracy. All the NGOs we fund, all the civil society activists, all the media institutions, is all democracy, democracy, democracy. So we need to simply, instead of getting rid of this concept of championing democracy, we need to redefine what democracy is. We need to make it not about the consensus of individuals, how people vote, but make it about the consensus of institutions. And we will simply define democratic institutions as anyone who supports the U.S. foreign policy establishment and its transatlantic partners in the UK.
So in the United States, that would mean redefining the system of government from one in which a majority of 350 million people believe something to one in which a group of, what would it be, 100,000 people?
Yeah, about that.
Yeah, maybe 100,000 people, probably a third of whom I know. In other words, it's like they just took all the power from the American population and awarded it to themselves.
Yes, and this clever rhetorical sleight of hand allows unspeakable powers that Americans have no idea about. I'll give you one example.
All right, so kind of going along with what you were just talking about there. Plus, this is the part where I was going, wait a second, this is kind of like the parallels between the Civil War and now is they're talking about taking the power away from 330 million people and giving it to 100,000 people. Well, that sounds an awful lot like what it was during the Civil War, where a small percentage of people in the South had great influence, great wealth, and things like that. But it came at the expense of all the other folks.
Yes, yeah, and I think that's how it always kind of ends up happening. I mean, you've got in any kind of in the Roman Republic, it devolved into the Caesars eventually, but it devolved into a corrupt set of senators, which used to be the ones that were responsible for the people. There was natural stratification in that society with rich and poor, so they didn't even pretend because they didn't know anything about this, equality of everybody and all that. But it always seems to devolve in that same way. You could take, say, the Soviet Union, this idea of we're against the rich. And so therefore workers of the world unite and arise. And so you've got this movement, and then it devolves back into Stalinist Soviet Union. So it always happens that way.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so fascinating to learning kind of the interweavings of this, how it just ain't that different, Dave.
It's just more sophisticated now. See,
The
I think
details are different. It's more sophisticated. There's more
yeah.
technology, but the underlying drivers and the desired outcomes all the same.
Right. The motivations don't change from generation to generation. Just the trappings of it. That's all.
All right. So now we're going to switch gears here a little bit. He's going to talk about elections a little bit. So let's hear what he's got to say about that.
A senior Pentagon official with a CIA blue badge. And they have, that conference in 2019, the title of it was how elections erode the democratic process, how elections are a threat to democracy. And because they were moving to this concept that the blob's control over the political and commercial ecosystem of a country cannot be left to the people. If we define democracy to be about democratic institutions, then the popular will of the people can still be categorized as a threat to democracy, which would therefore still allow the funding of the billions of dollars worldwide that we have deployed as capital for this.
All right. So that resonating with our current situation.
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, if you look at any of the things that have happened in the past few years, you look at the COVID response, you look at this notion that half of the country is a threat. Half of the country is a threat to democracy. I mean, come on, just unpack that a little bit, right? It's like, if 165 million people are a threat to democracy, well, what is democracy then? Because, this definitionally, if you got half of the people, well, on either side, you've got a near majority can't be a threat to democracy. It's just it's cognitive dissonance.
It's the definition of democracy if one side wins.
Yes. It's complete cognitive dissonance.
But you look at the SAVE Act, which they wouldn't pass. They tried to attach it to a continuing resolution. They wouldn't pass that, and that's probably dead in the water.
Yeah.
You look at the open border. You look at all the election rules state by state that changed during COVID that allowed for all kinds of levels of fraud and things like that. And I just all throughout all these things, I'm always at like, why would they want this to happen?
Right.
And now he sums it up, because elections are a threat to democracy if you define democracy as looking out for the fortunes and whatever of the institutions.
The maintenance and thriving of the institutions under the guise of resisting totalitarian threats. And ultimately, I think that's what you could say. And I wouldn't, I'm sure that a ton of people that define democracy that way believe that's the right thing.
Yeah.
I'm sure they do. I'm sure they believe that, what we're defending these institutions because, Brian, you and Dave, you don't know what's best for you, and you don't know that if we're not in charge, then Xi Jinping and the communists are going to come in and they're going to take over. And as a red-blooded American patriot, we need to preserve all these institutions that have served us and won us World War II, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. And that gets back into the fourth turning generations. You build these institutions and you believe that these institutions which saved you once or which rose out of what saved you before are going to save you again. And it's just not true. The institutions that came out of saving us become the very thing that ends up throwing us back under the bus again.
Yeah. So I agree with everything you just said. There's people who absolutely believe that this is what's necessary, and it's married to this human behavior that we just want to be taken care of.
Yes. Yeah.
Like we just want it to be easier. It shouldn't have to be so hard.
Right.
The government should be there to take care of me. That is, the desire to be taken care of. Dennis Prager said this before. The desire to be taken care of is stronger than a desire for liberty and freedom.
Yeah.
And so those things, you take all the things you said, and you merge it together with people just craving this being taken care of and craving life not to be so hard. And it's a perfect mousetrap.
And it gets worse and worse, because the worse things get, the more people want safety and security
Yes.
and stability and to be taken care of. And so it's a snake that eats itself.
And they're counting on these institutions that are behind the scenes falling apart and being corrupted and bastardized and all these things. And it's not until they realize, holy crap, these things have completely fallen apart. And not until it negatively impacts them personally is when they have the awakening. You go back to Yuri Bezmenov. Like, we could show them the concentration camps. They wouldn't believe it.
Yeah.
Because it's so strong of a desire to win and to be taken care of and not have to work so hard and for somebody to bail me out and whatever. He's like, and remember, he said, not until you were the one in the concentration camp, then immediately you get it, but not up until that moment.
And you're just, and you can't believe it. You can't believe that it's happening. You can't accept that it's happening because that's not normal. That's not how it's always worked. And this has always worked for us. I've always been able to, I'm sure in Germany, we have always trusted the police. Now, you're telling me that the Gestapo is doing all this stuff? It can't be. No,
No. Well, the Jews must have done something bad then. Maybe there's just things I didn't know, because they're promising to take care of you.
Right. Well, I think it's a natural. I find myself, I'm listening to the news sometimes. I listen to a variety of different news sources, not just my own side, my own conservative side. But, you listen to it, and then there's something reported, that can't. And even now, I'm like, no, that's just, they're missing something. They have to be missing something, because you just can't accept, and you have good reason not to accept those things, because your entire life, that's not how it's worked. So, it's just not been normal. So you end up in this self-delusion, like you say, until it's staring you in the face across some razor wire.
Yeah. All right, now he's going to talk about the universities and how they're involved. And this is the longest clip. This is a little over 2 minutes, so I apologize for those listening that this is. Well, maybe they like it. Maybe they like hearing this guy talk better than me and you. I don't know. But, this is the longest clip. It's a little over 2 minutes, but it helps understand how the universities are involved.
To U.S. universities, this is a part of why so much of U.S. universities, so much work is funded by the Defense Department. And is funded by the National Science Foundation. It's civilian arm. In fact, the National Science Foundation is the leading subsidizer of all. It's the leading source of funding for all higher education funds. I'm not even, like, people think we have a private higher education market. We don't. It's subsidized by the U.S. government, and that is a quid pro quo.
But through DOD.
Through DOD and through the National Science Foundation, which is the civilian, but the National Science Foundation. And even the story of the internet, again, it was created by the U.S. military, and it was turned over to the National Science Foundation. And that's where the dual use comes in. When the military developed the cell phone, the military developed GPS, the military developed most of the technology at the R&D level that we now live under. In fact, the military developed all of the internet anonymity software in order to help Pentagon and CIA and State Department-backed political groups be able to orchestrate regime change. The VPNs, the Tor network, end-to-end encrypted chat, all these things were Pentagon projects before they became dual use, just like the internet became dual use. It was a military project, but then then the civilian commercial architecture was built on top of it. But the National Science Foundation has two major domestic censorship programs. And in the charter documents establishing one of them in 2021, when, in February 2021, right when the month after Biden took office. This is a $40 million program, and in the charter document, it says that the purpose is to stop misinformation about democratic institutions. And one of the democratic institutions they define is the media. So understand this. This is the Pentagon civilian arm funding $40 million worth of censorship, exclusively censorship institutions, to stop Americans from delegitimizing the media, to stop Americans from undermining trust in media. If North Korea did this.
All right. So I didn't know that the government subsidized academia like that. Did you? I had no idea.
Well, not to that. No, I didn't know they did it to that level. I mean, I'm aware of NSF grants and such, that type of stuff from my years selling into higher ed and K-12. But I wouldn't have guessed it's the majority. That's news to me. That's surprising.
Yeah. And so, again, one of the things I've always been asking is like, well, what's in it for academia? Well, that's the same thing that's in it for what's in it for the big news channels, to not to say anything about, anti-COVID or whatever. Well, their funding comes from
Money.
the people. The funding comes from big pharmaceutical companies who are making a fortune on that.
Follow
So
money. Yeah.
again, he goes into more detail, and I'm selecting clips here that kind of explain things generally, but he goes into more detail about, like, you can't tell the people giving you money, like, we're not going to go along with this thing. And they're
Right.
explicitly being told to, prop up the institutions. And one of those is media. And
Yeah.
so that captures, so now we have big government, we got we got the kind of the military industrial complex / CIA, whatever that blob is. And now we've got big business covered. We got academia covered now, and we got the media covered now. So we got 4 of the 5 all coming together in this way, right? All under the guise of perpetuating democracy.
Right. Keeping the institutions alive and in power. And oddly enough, using our own tax dollars to control us. So
Yeah.
it's quite the kind of Orwellian
Yeah.
formula.
He's gonna talk about it here in a second. It's taking me just a second to get it queued up to the right spot, but he's gonna talk about that very thing here in the next couple little bits here. So let me share my screen again, and we'll pick up where you left off, or pick up in a different section here.
It's such an abuse. It's honestly the end of this sort of idea that this favors for favors relationship between big government and big corporations has a trickle-down effect to help the welfare of the American people. This has always been the justification for the national champion policy at the State Department, that when big government, when the Pentagon and State Department and CIA and USAID and the whole swarm of soft power institutions do favors for ExxonMobil or Microsoft or Walmart or Pepsi, then that means cheaper retail products for us. We have the export markets because we control that government. We have the natural resources, so we have cheap gas, middle-class living. But this has completely inverted that, because it's big government teaming up with big corporations specifically to deprive Americans of access to those platforms. But again, it's to protect the institutions against the individuals. It's to protect this this constellation of cloistered foreign policy institutions and their international agenda installed at a regional level on every plot of dirt on earth, from being opposed by people who might vote against them organically in a free and open information market.
Yeah. So the all the we talk about propaganda, like propaganda is a word I heard up until 5 years ago, 6 years ago. The only time I ever heard the word propaganda is when they were talking about what the Soviet Union did to
Right.
their citizens.
Right.
What China did I never heard propaganda talked as a U.S. government
Right.
policy, not just an action, but a policy as he's describing it up until 5 or 6 years ago.
Well, yeah, at least not from my perspective, at least not in terms of us us, aka the U.S., through our institutions propagandizing ourselves.
Right.
I mean, maybe we, I've been aware of the CIA's involvement in information influence campaigns over across the world in different places. We don't want this dictator to come to power. There's Noriega, there's Cuba, there's all these different things. But never would I have imagined that it would be government collusion with media to propagandize the American people. That's
well, he talks about how that whole thing changed in 2014, and he cites very specific things which I don't have memorized and we don't have time to go into, but he talks about how all those things that were externally done to do all the things you're talking about, regime change, government
right.
overthrows, getting votes the way we want. Again, like his example was like, what if it was the graphite industry in Somalia? Like, okay,
Yeah.
we need to propagandize to get the outcomes we want. Well, all those things have been turned inward now.
Right.
And at the same time, implementing the censorship policy.
And it seems interesting that there's a necessity to prop that up to continue to deepen it all the time. I mean, it's when
Yeah.
you tell a little white lie, and you've got to tell another white lie to, so here's this little harmless thing, and then you have to layer another one, and eventually you've layered this monster of propaganda, deception, misdirection, all
Yeah.
of that, and so it's like, when does it come collapsing down? Because it
Right.
can't.
And simultaneously, some of those things are probably in our best interests. Some of those
Sure.
things
Oh,
probably
yeah.
are good to have happen. But
Yeah.
how do you tell? And like he gets into all that stuff again. I didn't have time to capture others. We're running short on time already. But he gets into that, like some of the stuff you actually want to do. Like you do want to get some of these people out of power.
Well, and that's absolutely. And see, this is the thing that I think is important one of the things that's important in the conversation is it's not, Boris Badenoff and Natasha who only have evil intentions. And, you think about conspiracy theories and that type of stuff. And it's like, there's 100% evil over here trying to control us. It's,
Yeah.
that's not what it is. It's
No.
people that oftentimes believe their own self-deceptions. They believe that they're better than the rest of us. That I would guess that that if you had a scientific instrument to measure ego and you overlaid it across the United States, probably the Virginia, Washington D.C., Maryland, all that would probably be glowing hot
Yeah.
because
It
they
was certainly
truly
with
believe it.
hubris. Yeah.
Yeah, they believe that it's in our best interest and in their best interest. So, I think it's
And if they
important to
make a little
say,
bit of money along the way, that's only right, Dave.
oh
That's
yeah,
only fair.
well, it was in, yeah, and see, that's it. It's like I'm sacrificing myself by running the whole world or running the
Yeah.
whole Western culture. Shouldn't I get a little bit for my trouble? It's
Yeah,
a
Nancy
normal
Pelosi should be
human
able to sell her
behavior.
$500,000 worth of Visa 2 weeks before that they're
Right.
investigated by the SEC or whatever. That's all. That's all
It's
it's
kind
supposed
of
to go.
it's a predictable human behavior,
Yeah,
but it doesn't change the fact that it's wrong.
yeah. No, I agree. All right, I got 3 more,
All right.
and so let me move along here so
All
we
right.
don't run over on time here. But this one he's going to talk a little bit about Ukraine.
Just made that change, and it will be. And like all of that is because they follow the advice of Washington. Do you think they think that?
Well, it doesn't matter what the people of Ukraine think. They're not allowed, no, but they're not allowed to have elections.
You're right.
They can't vote their way out of it. There's no elections. And mind you, you can look, everyone listening right now can look up something called the Red Lines memo from the Ukraine Crisis Media group, which is basically a conglomerate of, all of these U.S. funded NGOs and civil society institutions in Ukraine. And they sent the so-called Red Lines memo to Zelensky when he took office. And they threatened Zelensky in that letter that if he took any of the below actions on security policy, on energy policy, on media policy, on cultural policy, 7 or 8 different buckets of internal policies that Zelensky might pursue, that if he crossed any of the red lines in terms of restoring use of the Russian language on Ukrainian TV or, interfering with the privatization of NAFTA and things like this, that if he crossed any of the red lines of the policy issues articulated by this U.S. Constellation, this U.S. NGO, which is an umbrella for all these other State Department NGOs, that Ukraine would face immediate political destabilization if any of those policies were enacted. Basically, the same rent-a-riots that were deployed by the U.S. State Department and the Central Intelligence Agency, and to some extent the Pentagon in the 2014 Maidan protests, would be redeployed against Zelensky if he decided to chart an independent course for the Ukrainian people. That he would be run out of office the same way, his predecessor Yanukovych was, by the same forces, if he did something that was in the will of the Ukrainian people but opposed the U.S. State Department.
So that to me sounds like a very similar tactic to what Zuckerberg was explaining here a couple weeks ago in his letter to Congress.
It's the same. It's the exact same thing. You play ball or else you're going down.
I think that the mafia could take a good lesson from some of this, huh?
Well, I don't know if there's any difference. I don't know if there's any difference. It's a protection, it's a protection scheme, right? It's like
A protection
as long
racket.
as you
Yeah.
play along, as long as I'm going to come by your store every Thursday, and you're going to give me 30% off the top of the week's sales, and then nothing bad's going to happen to you. But you stop doing that, and some bad things are going to happen.
So the reason I say that one is because you and I don't talk about Ukraine on here a lot, which is you could spend 4 episodes just on
Oh
that. But
yeah,
I just thought it's fascinating. The very behaviors he's describing there, are the very same behaviors Zuckerberg was describing, and it all
right,
goes back to censorship, and it all goes back to propping up the institutions and silencing the people who speak out against that stuff,
right.
which is antithetical to everything I was raised to believe our country was about.
It's anti-democratic because it's
Yeah,
against the people, but not against the institutions.
yeah. All right, I got 2 more clips here, and so I'll go through these pretty quick here because we're running short on time. But here's the next one.
When the U.S. Chamber of Commerce turned against Trump, the only parity that the Republican Party had against Democrats for the past 100 years has been the fact that that while Democrats had the media, Hollywood, music and culture, unions, and to some extent finance, Republicans had the war industry, the energy industry, and the Chamber of Commerce, because these Chamber of Commerce companies preferred republicanism for its free market, free enterprise, and low tax structure. The problem is Trump sort of, stepped on a rattlesnake with this idea of making America first and American nationalism, to the extent that it cut back on American interventionalism, American, constant democracy promotion abroad. He was the first president in 40 years not to, declare a new war effectively. So you had all these Chamber of Commerce companies whose the lion's share of the revenue is dependent on foreign markets, or whose supply chains are sourced in foreign countries. And they need a big bad CIA. They need a big bad State Department. They need a big bad USAID and a big bad Pentagon if necessary. And so Trumpism became a sort of threat to the bottom line of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And so I come back to this because the commercial interests here are sort of driving what's happening at the intelligence and military and diplomatic policy level.
All right, so this answers a question I had for a long time, which is, what happened to business? Why did you and I talked a couple weeks ago about how there's this whole shift happening where used to be the Democrats represented the common working man, quote unquote, and
Right.
Republicans were big business, and now there's this flip. And I
Yep.
never could understand it. Like, how is it that Kamala Harris right now is losing the Teamster endorsement and gaining the Meta endorsement? Like,
Right.
it's like but it all makes sense now.
Yeah, because it all comes back to the mother's milk of everything, of politics and national. I mean, you look at companies like Apple and others. A huge chunk of their revenue comes from China, comes from other countries other than just the U.S. So, as a I mean, I think it's inevitable that we will be a global trading, and not traitor, but trading. I think that's inevitable. But the influence exerted then, because of that influx of cash, and because it maintains our role as the reserve currency of the world, then that's all power. All of that is just pure, raw, unmitigated power, and they need to perpetuate it.
For example, Halliburton, famously, who is the famous CEO of Halliburton? Dick Cheney. Well, who did he just endorse? Kamala Harris.
Kamala, yep.
Halliburton owns the oil and gas processing rights in Ukraine.
Oh, well, there you go. I didn't know that.
So things like that, and ExxonMobil has their tentacles in it, and Shell has their tentacles in it, and all these and we're talking tens or hundreds of billions of dollars.
Yeah.
Of which that 100,000 people they were talking about a little while ago will get a pretty good chunk of it.
Disproportionately high share. Yeah. I haven't got my stock certificates yet. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know if your stock's going to do as well as the CEO. I mean, you'll probably do pretty close. I know you own a great, tremendous share of that stuff.
Yeah, I'm working on it.
All right, last one here.
Okay.
And he's going to talk a little bit more about the inner weavings of big business and big government here. All right. Well, maybe we won't get to see the last clip here, but essentially he's talking again about how big business and big government see nationalism as a threat. And this might be the clip where he talked about what you're talking about, where he's talking about like how the truck drivers, how their taxes are going to pay for all this stuff.
Right, right.
All right. Well, it doesn't look like we're going to be able to get it, but
so everybody go look up that clip. This is a cliffhanger for you, so you can go look up the last bit of Mike Benz clip interview with Tucker Carlson.
Yeah.
And you'll see what we've been talking about.
Well, that's a bummer. Oh well, hey, I got through all the rest of them though, and it went actually way smoother than I thought it would. So
Absolutely,
I'm
it was
actually
good.
pretty happy with that. So anyhow, for me, this was again it's 2 hours and 7 minutes long. At Mike Benz Cyber is his Twitter handle, and at Tucker Carlson is his Twitter handle. 2 hour and 7 minute interview where I mean I just thought it was fascinating how it pulled all these pieces together, all the things that you and I complained about, Dave.
Yeah,
censorship and misinformation and malinformation, all that kind of stuff, and how the parties shifted, why there's this great divide now. Like a lot of these questions have been answered for me in this little bit.
and it's worthwhile to, even if you're not convinced of this, even if some of the folks that are listening aren't convinced, it's an interesting thought experiment to when you hear the news next, to put on the other set of glasses and say, what if that's not just crazy conspiracy talk? What if it's really the way things are? And just, think about it from two perspectives for a change.
Well, and one of the things with him specifically is, he's not, I wouldn't consider, I'm guessing he probably has values like you and I.
Sure.
But
yeah.
What he's really cares about is free speech.
Yeah.
He's not really partisan.
Yeah.
But he has identified which party is for free speech and which party is not, or which group of us, I won't say party because I think there's plenty of Republicans who've been elected that are not for free speech, but he's a free speech on the internet absolutist. That's his entire mission and purpose, is to get free speech on the internet. So he's not, I wouldn't say he's like a super partisan guy. Like he's not a Glenn Beck kind of guy. I mean, he's just, I think he's, through his lens, calling balls and strikes. I don't think he's super biased. It could be, I could be saying that because I'm biased, I suppose, but I don't get that impression from him.
Well, and probably, I mean, I've seen other clips of his and seen him not speak in person, but I've seen him speak online, and it seems like he's seen it from the inside. And so that probably, if you've seen something, it's like, that's not right. That's not what I was told when I started here. I think that probably would tend to push you in the direction that he's obviously going, because he's seen the misuse with his own two eyes in his career.
Yeah, and he puts out a video or two a day. It seems like he really dives into this stuff. Anyhow, for Kenny G, I guess the lesson here would be, even when you think things can be trusted and think there are things going under behind the scenes and under the current that you can't see and feel, you'll just know something is off.
Yeah.
And there is.
Yep.
You're not crazy, Kenny G. That's what I'm telling him.
It's human nature.
Yeah. All right. Well, hey, we'd love to hear your feedback. If you think this is helping get clarity for you, and as it was for me, we'd love to hear about that. If you think we're completely nuts for putting a guy like that on, we'd love to hear that too. And until next time, this is Dave and Brian signing off.
See you next week.
Do you want to be Unsilent? Make your voice heard on our social media channels and share where you think we got it right or wrong. Go to unsilentpodcast.com for social links so you can join the discussion.